The dry heat of West Texas has a way of baking secrets into the red earth until they crack and bleed. I learned that the hard way when I was 17, a girl with wide eyes and a heart that hadn't yet been scarred by the thorns of the desert. He was 23, a man who smelled of expensive leather and cheap tobacco, carrying a silence that I mistook for maturity. In the dusty outskirts of El Paso, Colton was the golden boy of the local rodeo circuit, a wolf who had mastered the art of wearing a sheep's wool coat. Looking back, the red flags were as bright as a Texas sunset, but I was blinded by the way he looked at me, as if I were the only oasis in a barren land. My acceptance into the University of Texas in Austin was the match that lit the fuse of his insecurity. He hadn't finished school, preferring the raw power of manual labor and the control he exerted over the horses he broke. When I spoke of my dreams, of the life I wanted beyond the barbed wire fences, his warmth turned to a frost that even the July sun couldn't melt. He started showing up at my dorm every weekend, his truck a constant menacing presence in the parking lot. He didn't come to support me. He came to dismantle me. He isolated me from my friends, whispering poisons about my roommates, claiming that every man who looked my way was a predator. The irony was a bitter pill I wasn't ready to swallow. The psychological warfare turned physical on the night that still haunts my dreams. After I graduated and landed a high-paying analyst job in Dallas, Colton realized his leash had snapped. He didn't just follow me. He hunted me. He stood outside my new office building, a disheveled ghost of the man I once thought I loved. The climax came when I found him at my doorstep, the silver flash of a hunting knife in his hand and a look in his eyes that suggested he had finally let the desert madness take him. If the Dallas police hadn't arrived when they did, I would have been just another cold case buried under the mesquite trees. A year in a county jail and a permanent restraining order seemed like a final curtain, a way to finally breathe without the scent of his tobacco choking my lungs. Peace is a fragile thing in a family built on pride and cattle. My younger sister, Shelby, had always been the delicate wildflower of our clan, 3 years my junior and shielded from the harsh truths of my ordeal with Colton. We were gathered at my parents' ranch for what I thought was a celebratory Sunday roast. My cousin Jolene was there too, always lingering in the shadows with a sharp smile and eyes that missed nothing. Jolene had been my confidant during the dark years, or so I thought, but lately she seemed to take a strange pleasure in bringing up Colton's name, asking if I ever wondered if he had truly changed behind bars. The bombshell didn't just drop. It detonated. Shelby stood up, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach, and announced that she was carrying a new life. The joy in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds, until she invited her partner inside. When Colton walked through those heavy oak doors, the air left the room. He didn't look like a convict. He looked like a man who had found a new prize to break. He held Shelby's hand with a possessive grip that made my blood run cold. My sister's defense of him was a masterclass in manipulation. She spoke of how they had connected on social media, how Jolene had encouraged her to reach out to him to understand his side of the story. My heart sank as I realized Jolene hadn't been a bystander. She had been the bridge. Shelby insisted that Colton had found God in therapy, that the knife incident was just a misunderstanding born of passionate love. She looked at me with eyes full of a terrifying, naive pity, calling me selfish for clinging to a restraining order when a baby was involved. The betrayal was multi-layered, a web woven with Jolene's quiet encouragements and Colton's predatory charm. My parents, God bless their souls, stood like granite pillars behind me, but the damage was done. The family was fractured, split between the reality of my trauma and the fantasy of Shelby's redemption arc. I walked out into the Texas night, feeling the eyes of my stalker on my back, knowing that the man who tried to kill my spirit was now the father of my future nephew. The weeks following the encounter were a blur of anxiety and a growing sense of dread that Colton's return wasn't just about Shelby. I felt like a character in a noir novel, watching the shadows for a truck that shouldn't be there. That was when Silas, an old family friend and a retired Texas Ranger who still wore his silver star in his heart, requested a private meeting at a diner in Amarillo. Silas didn't speak much, but when he did, his words had the weight of lead. He handed me a weathered leather ledger he had, recovered from an old associate of Colton's. Without saying it, Silas became my guardian, a silent protagonist working in the periphery of my collapsing world. The ledger contained names, dates, and amounts that hinted Colton's obsession with me hadn't been just about love. It appeared Colton had been deep in debt to a local cattle rustling syndicate, and my family's land, the mineral rights, specifically, was the collateral he had promised them years ago. He hadn't just stalked me because he wanted me. He had targeted me because I was the heir to the most valuable portion of the ranch. When I escaped to Dallas, his plan failed, and his time in jail was spent refining a new strategy. My sister, Shelby, was the easier lock to pick. Jolene's involvement became clearer too. The ledger showed small payments to her bank account during my university years, payments for information on my whereabouts and my mental state. My own cousin had been selling my safety for silver. Silas warned me that the upcoming wedding at the county courthouse wasn't a union of hearts, but a closing of a contract. Colton needed to be legally tied to the family before the syndicate came to collect. The realization that my sister was being used as a human shield for a land grab made the situation even more urgent. Silas promised to keep digging, his eyes reflecting the cold justice of the Old West. He told me to stay away from the courthouse, to let the law handle the beast. But Shelby's hysterical calls wouldn't stop. She begged me to drop the restraining order as a wedding gift, claiming Colton couldn't start fresh with a legal cloud over his head. She didn't know she was inviting a predator into her bed to steal her inheritance, and Jolene was standing by with a bridesmaid's dress and a hidden agenda. The day of the courthouse wedding in Pecos arrived with a heat so oppressive it felt like the sky was trying to flatten the earth. I sat in my truck across the street, the air conditioning humming a losing battle against the Texas sun. I watched them arrive, the remnants of my family, walking into that limestone building like they were attending a funeral they hadn't quite admitted to. Shelby looked fragile, a ghost in ivory lace, her hand constantly seeking Colton's arm as if he were the only thing keeping her from drifting away into the desert wind. Jolene was right behind them, her eyes scanning the street with a predatory sharpness that didn't belong at a wedding. She was the one who had organized everything, the one who had silenced my parents, protests with talk of family unity and new beginnings. I saw Silas parked a block away, his silhouette motionless behind the wheel, a silent guardian who had promised me that justice had a long memory in this part of the state. The ceremony was supposed to be a simple affair, but the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Just as they reached the top of the stone steps, a black SUV with dark windows pulled up to the curb. The engine didn't stop. It just idled like a growling beast. I saw Colton's posture change instantly. The bravado he had worn like a suit of armor crumbled. He didn't look like a groom anymore. He looked like a man who had seen his executioner. A man stepped out of the back. Not a police officer, but a tall, thin figure in a charcoal suit that looked out of place in the dusty heat of Pecos. He didn't say a word, just raised a hand. Jolene didn't look surprised. In fact, she took a step away from Shelby, her face settling into a cold, clinical mask. Colton didn't even look back at my sister. He walked toward the SUV as if pulled by an invisible chain. The betrayal was so swift, so clinical that for a moment, the world seemed to stop spinning. The SUV sped off, leaving a cloud of red dust and my sister standing alone on the steps, her bouquet of yellow roses falling to the pavement like a discarded hope. In the chaotic aftermath, as my parents rushed to comfort a catatonic Shelby, I followed the trail Silas had laid out for me. We met at an abandoned pump jack on the edge of the family property, a place where the rhythmic thumping of the oil machinery felt like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Silas revealed the truth behind the man in the charcoal suit. Mr. Sterling, a third-generation oil baron whose family had been eyeing our land for nearly a century. The debt Colton owed wasn't just to some street-level thugs. It was a carefully constructed financial trap set by Sterling. Colton had been a pawn from the beginning, a tool used to infiltrate our family. But the real sting came when Silas handed me a recording. It was a conversation between Sterling and Jolene. My cousin wasn't just a facilitator. She was the architect. She had been Sterling's informant for years, nursing a deep-seated resentment over her branch of the family being cut out of the original land trust. Her plan was to use Colton to marry into the estate, then have him sign over the rights to Sterling in exchange for clearing his gambling debts and a tidy sum for herself. The pregnancy was the ultimate insurance policy, a way to ensure that even if the marriage failed, the claim to the land would remain through the child. As I listened to her cold, calculating voice on the tape, explaining how she had manipulated Shelby's loneliness and my trauma, I felt a part of me harden into something as cold as the steel of the pump jack. The drama of our family wasn't a tragedy of errors. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a romance. Jolene had played us all, using my sister's womb as a bargaining chip for a piece of the Texas earth. Silas looked at me with a weary understanding, his hand resting on the holster he still wore out of habit. He told me that in Texas, land was the only thing worth killing for, and Jolene was a true daughter of the soil in the worst possible way. The weeks that followed were a silent war of nerves. Shelby, broken and refusing to believe the truth, moved in with Jolene, seeing her as the only person who understood her grief. I watched from the shadows as Jolene played the role of the supportive sister figure, all while preparing the legal paperwork that would finalize the transfer of the mineral rights. My parents were paralyzed by the scandal, their reputation in the community shattered by the public, abandonment at the courthouse. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, navigating the grand halls of our ranch house that now felt like a cage. Silas, acting as my silent partner, began a series of counter-moves that felt like a high-stakes poker game. He leaked information about Sterling's illegal drilling practices to the state authorities, creating a distraction that slowed down the legal machinery. But the real confrontation happened inside the house. I found Jolene in the kitchen one evening, her face illuminated by the pale light of the refrigerator. There were no dialogues, only the heavy, unspoken weight of our shared history. I placed the ledger Silas had found on the counter. She didn't flinch. She just looked at it, then at me, with a smile that was more of a baring of teeth. In her eyes, I saw a mirror of my own determination, but twisted by a lifetime of perceived slights. She believed she was the protagonist of her own story, the disenfranchised heir reclaiming her birthright. To her, I was the villain who had everything handed to me on a silver platter. The air between us was electric, charged with the knowledge that only one of us could remain when the dust finally settled. She didn't need to speak. Her actions in the coming days would be her manifesto. She began to isolate Shelby even further, feeding her lies about how I had orchestrated Colton's disappearance to steal the child once it was born. The psychological warfare had reached its peak, and I realized that to save my sister, I would have to lose her completely. The climax came on a night when the Texas sky was filled with lightning but no rain, a dry storm that reflected the hollow intensity of our feud. I led Silas to the old line shack near Red Rock Creek, where I knew Jolene was meeting Sterling to finalize the documents. I didn't want a legal battle. I wanted a confession that even Shelby couldn't ignore. I had hidden my sister in the back of the shack, forcing her to listen to the reality of her protectors. As Sterling's SUV pulled up, the silence was deafening. I stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the flickering storm. Sterling was confident, holding the papers like a scepter. Jolene stood by him, already smelling the victory. But as Sterling began to boast about how easy it had been to break our family, how Colton had been nothing but a cheap pawn, and how Jolene's greed had been the perfect key, I saw the curtain drop. He admitted to the staged disappearance, to the plan to institutionalize Shelby after the birth, and to the fact that Colton was already buried in an unmarked grave near the border, his usefulness exhausted. The look on Jolene's face wasn't one of horror, but of irritation. She hadn't expected him to be so blunt in front of me. That was when Shelby stepped out of the shadows. Her scream wasn't a sound of anger, but of a soul shattering. In the chaos that followed, Silas emerged from the brush, his presence enough to freeze Sterling in his tracks. There were no shots fired, no dramatic brawls, just the cold, hard reality of exposure. Sterling fled knowing his reputation, and his empire were now under the microscope of a man who didn't take bribes. Jolene, ever the survivor, tried to reach out to Shelby, but my sister looked at her as if she were a venomous snake. The victory was absolute, but it felt like ashes. The ranch was saved, the predator was gone, but the family was a charred ruin. As the first drops of rain finally hit the dry Texas earth, I realized that some wounds don't heal. They just become part of the landscape. I stood with my sister in the mud, two survivors of a war fought in the shadows, knowing that while the land remained, the people we were before the storm were gone forever. 6 months have passed since the red mud of Red Rock Creek washed away the last illusions of my youth. The Texas summer has finally surrendered to a biting, dry autumn, and the ranch stands silent, a monument to a family that survived a war only to lose itself in the peace. Shelby's son was born in late October, a boy she named Jesse, after our grandfather. When I look at him, I don't see Colton's predatory eyes. I see a blank slate, a new beginning for a bloodline that was nearly sold for mineral rights. My sister lives in a cottage on the far edge of the property, a distance she maintains like a physical wound. She doesn't blame me anymore. The silence between us is worse than blame. It is the realization that I was the one who had to kill her fairy tale to save her life. She spends her days staring out at the horizon, a young mother tethered to a legacy she never wanted. Silas remains our shadow, a silent sentinel who checks the perimeter fences every Tuesday. He never asks for payment, and we never offer it. In this part of the world, some debts are paid in loyalty that transcends the law. But the desert has a way of hiding things that refuse to stay buried. Jolene disappeared shortly after the confrontation, vanishing into the neon sprawl of Houston, or perhaps across the border into Mexico. I thought we were rid of her until a week ago, when a legal notice arrived from a firm in San Antonio. It turns out Jolene hadn't just been Sterling's informant. She had managed to siphon off a portion of the mineral rights into a shell company before we even knew. There was a leak. She's not coming back for the land. She's waiting for the oil prices to peak, a patient vulture circling the remains of her own family. Sterling, meanwhile, faced a quiet ruin, his reputation dismantled by Silas's well-placed evidence, though men like him always find a way to land on their feet in a different suit. I sit on the porch now, the weight of the family ledger in my lap and a loaded shotgun by the door. I am no longer the girl who dreamt of Austin or Dallas. I am the keeper of the ranch, the woman who learned that love is a luxury and land is a religion. The air smells of incoming rain and old secrets. And as I watch the sun dip below the jagged peaks, I realize the drama isn't over. It has simply changed its rhythm. I am the protagonist of a story that cost me my soul. And somewhere out there, in the vast Texan night, the antagonist is still counting her silver, waiting for the wind to shift,